Okay, let us continue now with our definition of autistic spectrum disorder from a multi-system developmental disabilities perspective. And let me click over on my notes here. The third area that children with autistic spectrum disorder manifest is a significant delay or dysfunction in auditory processing skills. That is perception, comprehension, and articulation. If you remember, Greenspan is or was a psychiatrist, not a linguist. So he separated out expression, and that was the previous focus, the focus of the previous symptomatology, difficulties producing generating symbols and dealing with symbols. And he identifies as well difficulty comprehending and perceiving and and articulating. Now, this perception, comprehension, articulation problem applies to language, verbal language, but it also relates to the next component of MSDD that Greenspan identifies, and that is significant delay or dysfunction in the processing of other sensations, including hypo-reactivity to visual, spatial, tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular input, as well as the processing of movement patterns, kinesthetics. Now, this is extremely important that autism involves a sensory motor component, and it affects multiple sensory motor modalities. You could presume that a child with autistic spectrum disorder has difficulties in proprioception, and that refers to our sense of where our body is in space, and kinesthetics, a sense of movement picked up through the Golgi joints in our the Golgi receptors in our joints. And so you'll see kids with autism. It's often said that all parents with children with autistic spectrum disorder have trampolines someplace in their house, because the kids are jumping or banging or doing something to get some input into their body, because they typically have difficulty sensing their own body. But the vestibular system, most kids when they spin around get dizzy, but often you'll find that kids with autism do spinning a lot, and they do not get affected by it the way that typically achieving children do. Now, Jean Ayres, who is a major name in the field of occupational therapy, identifies the second function of the vestibular system. Remember that the primary function of the vestibular system is to maintain our body, our head essentially, at a 90-degree angle from the ground, and helps us maintain balance by controlling the equilibrium reactions. Thus, we get car sick, etc., when we try to read in a car, because your body is constantly trying to right itself and maintain that 90-degree angle. Well, kids with autism have difficulty in this vestibular system, but Ayres has suggested that the vestibular system has a sensory integration function. And by that I mean, and that Ayres meant, that what it does is helps us integrate information coming through multiple senses. Temple Grandin, who is a very well-known individual with autism, who actually has a PhD and lectures on autism, on what it's like to have autism, has explained that she has tremendous difficulty listening and looking and feeling and having multiple sensory input at any particular time. She used to lecture by facing away from her audience. She used to lecture with her audience behind her, because she couldn't deal with the visual sight and her own speaking and the noise or any verbal input coming from the audience. In fact, keep in mind, it's so obvious perhaps that we don't even think about it, but as you're watching me, you have visual input coming from me through the machine. You have auditory input coming through the machine. Now, if you and I were a little closer, I might shake your hands and I say hi to, nice to meet you. Then you would have tactile information, kinesthetic information, etc., all coming at you at the same time. Well, that is a challenge for people with autism. Another component of this challenge is is difficulty with perception across modalities. And the last symptom that area that Greenspan referred to was auditory perception, which has something to do with distinguishing the phonemes of the language as you have language coming in speech coming into you. You remember from the speech science courses, speech perception, distinguishing phonemes based on that, again, high-speed processing, which I think we spoke about before. In any event, kids with autism don't only have that problem in the area of audition, but in within other behavioral systems as well. So typically there's a visual perceptual issue, and many kids with autism, you'll see them really focusing in on unusual visual configurations, such as, you can't see behind me, but I'm looking at a box that I have standing up, which I position sometimes a light on or a camera on, and it's got lines on it, where behind me you see this door sill or whatever you call it. Well, a child with autism might focus in on the lines on that, they will. Here's I have over here my external drive. So something visually might grab perhaps this piece, and you might see a child either focusing very, very closely onto some configuration there, or spinning it somehow and picking up on the movement. And this suggests a visual, perceptual issues, visual perception, and really across the behavioral systems. So this multi-system developmental disability approach to autistic spectrum disorder is very, very useful. It really gives us the recognition that the behaviors of these kids are a function of the contribution, are really efforts to overcome or deal with information processing characteristics that they're experiencing. And so thus multi-system developmental disability. We'll continue on in a moment.